Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. There is a great deal I could talk about today, of course, in terms of Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces have recently taken the city of Lyman. This comes just after Putin's extremely absurd annexation of the east of Ukraine. They've already retreated from some of the territory they now say is part of Russia. There's what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline, many other things to discuss. But I want to take a bit of a break from that subject and talk about the economies of the Baltic countries because they are under severe strain, particularly when it comes to inflation. Now, I've done a video previously on inflation in the Baltic countries, and at that stage, I was talking about what an imminent disaster it was that they had reached some 12-13% inflation, by far the highest in Europe at that time, and all the economic problems that would result from that. Well, things have deteriorated significantly. As of now, the September numbers have come in. Lithuania and Latvia are both running over 22% inflation. Estonia is running over 24% inflation for the second month in a row. This has significant and grave consequences for the economies of the Baltic countries. So before I go on, a quick recap on inflation for anyone who doesn't know. Inflation is the increasing cost of goods and services. That is, if you're buying a dozen eggs and the cost one day is $2 and then you come back a while later and it's $3, that's inflation. So if you have $100 in your wallet, at the moment, as of this recording, it's buying $100 worth of products, goods and services, but that same $100 will buy fewer goods and services in the future. And a small inflation rate is positive because it means the economy is growing. Wages increase as well to keep up with the cost of inflation, and that is a stable economic development pathway. But when things get radically out of whack, in this case, runaway inflation, then it creates serious problems for the economy as a whole and certainly the people within it, because wages cannot keep up with the increasing cost of goods and services. That means that people's buying power is radically curtailed and it creates all kinds of economic problems. For example, people realize that they need to spend their money really quickly because if they put it away in savings accounts, if they put it away for future investment, well, that money is going to have less buying power in the future, so they have an incentive to spend that money today. So that's just one of many problems. One of the problems with inflation is that it's deeply regressive. It affects those on lower incomes disproportionately because those on lower incomes are spending a higher percentage of their income on week-to-week goods like fuel, accommodation, food, things that are the staples. If they increase, if you're spending 80% of your income on those products and that increases, well, that becomes 100% of your income, and then you're underwater if it increases further. Whereas if you are wealthier, if you have a higher income, then you have more discretionary spending. You can allocate higher portions of your income to more luxury and discretionary goods. You roll back on that spending when it becomes prohibitively expensive, but you can still afford the increasing costs of everyday products. Now, one of the things that has mitigated this to a degree in the Baltic countries was the fact that during the pandemic, people didn't have as much to spend money on, and so savings rates increased dramatically. The deposits in the bank accounts in the Baltic region have reached some 11 billion euros. It's increased significantly. In absolute terms, it's still increasing, although the rate of rise has dramatically reduced, and that creates a buffer for a number of households. The problem is that these savings are not at all evenly distributed. They're concentrated at the very top. Again, those people that were already most able to cope with the increasing cost of goods and services. So at the higher end of the income distribution, they are not feeling the economic effects basically at all. They've got a significant buffer in savings and they can already absorb the increasing costs of everyday living. So those most deeply affected are those in the bottom half income distribution, in fact, bottom 80% income distribution, particularly older people whose earnings have peaked. They can't demand the same level of wage increases their primary vehicle for wealth is in their housing. Now, homes have increased in value dramatically in the Baltic over the past few years, particularly in Lithuania and Estonia. However, the latest projections are that it's overheated, that the fundamentals of the housing market cannot sustain current prices. And that's also extremely damaging for younger people who have entered the housing market recently, particularly those focusing on new construction. One of the things that happens in an overheating market is that people pay before their property is even built. So there's a significant backlog of construction in the Baltic countries as younger people seeking to get into the housing market are willing to take out big loans before their property is finished, in the idea that if they need to sell it down the track, well, housing prices are continuing to increase, and therefore they can sell that property and still make their money back and even a profit, rather than waiting for the property to be finished, buying it at a retail price, which may be significantly higher than if they buy it off the plan right now. Now, that works if the housing market continues to increase, but we're seeing this across the world, in the United States, also particularly in China, that when the housing market then collapses, all these people have significant debt burdens in a declining market. And one of the things that countries do to curtail inflation is to increase interest rates. And we're seeing the European Central Bank aggressively increase interest rates, making the housing affordability, the housing repayments, the mortgages even more expensive. But it's kind of the worst of both worlds for the Baltic countries, because the European Central Bank is trying to tackle inflation as a whole. The average inflation rate across Europe is about 9%. So even though it's increasing interest rates to reduce spending, that's not having nearly enough effect on the inflation rates in the Baltic countries, which are continuing to run away. I remember in 2021, the inflation rate was already high at around 6% in Lithuania. The fact that it's over 22% now and getting worse is a major concern for the economy. It also has a significant impact on business because the cost of imports is significantly higher. The wage demands of the population, because they want to increase wages to maintain their spending power relative to inflation, means that their labor costs continue to increase. That reduces business competitiveness relative to other countries in Europe. Now, in terms of the cost of import, it has kept in line with the other European countries. Therefore, the Baltic states have not been disadvantaged when it comes to imports relative to these other economies. But where they are disadvantaged is in labor costs, because there is a labor shortage in the Baltic countries. The fact that inflation is now ridiculously high means that various trade unions demand high increase in wages to maintain, reasonable living standards, and therefore labor production costs going into Lithuanian businesses, Estonian businesses is much higher. And we're already seeing a declining market share among Baltic countries as other European businesses that compete with Baltic industries are able to take some of that market share away because of the competition of price. Okay, so what is accounting for the inflation in the Baltic countries? Naturally, energy is at the very top of that list. 40% increase in oil and gas expenses for households in the Baltic region just this year. Obvious reasons as to why, I don't need to go into it, except to say that that takes up around 30 to 40% of the entire consumer price index of those countries. Therefore, it has a disproportionate impact on everyday household budgets. But it's not just these goods as well. Even luxury items have increased dramatically as a consequence of the cost of freight, cost of transportation. So for example, coffee beans, just coffee beans alone, have increased some 240% this year in the Baltic region, which is more than other countries because of the distances these goods have to travel. Now, exacerbating the cost of production in Baltic countries is the extremely exposed nature of their economies. Some 70-80% of their economies are export driven. So if foreign countries manage to cut into their market share, that has a disproportionate impact on the country as a whole. Therefore, it's going to seriously reduce their economic growth. Also, spending in those countries has increased on non-economically productive goods, even though they're absolutely necessary. So for example, defense expenditure in the Baltic countries has increased dramatically. Support for Ukraine, of course, has increased both in the government level and at the everyday societal consumer spending level. So the buffer that they have to go against the inflation rate is significantly reduced. Now, it's important to understand the impact that this kind of inflation can have, not just on the economy as a whole, which I've broadly described, but individuals themselves. Let's say you have 100 euros at the beginning of the year. Well, at the end of the year, if your inflation rate is 25%, then that 100 euros has the spending power of 75 euros. And even if your inflation rate reduces down to 10% the following year, that's compounded on the previous year. So that 75 euros then becomes worth 62 euros 50. Almost half of your 100 euros has collapsed in its spending power in less than 2 years. Because the interest rates are controlled by the European Central Bank, they don't increase aggressively enough to either increase the value of term deposits in Baltic countries. For example, they invest their money and get a return to keep up with inflation, or to reduce spending in the economy that would further curtail inflation. There is a significant lag in that regard, and also a lack of control that the national banks within the Baltic region have to control monetary policy. So this is a real worry. Now, there are some mitigations. As said, savings levels in the Baltic region is extremely high, even though it's not evenly distributed or distributed to those that most need it. It is nevertheless useful. Also, the fact that there is a labor shortage is a positive, because it means that there are capacity straits in the economy. Even though demand for Baltic goods has weakened in the export economies, even though other countries have cut into their market share, much of their production is domestic limitation. So if they manage to recruit more people, they can produce more goods, and there is a demand for those goods in the open market. So despite the increased cost of wages, they are still managing to sell their products and therefore continuing to grow the economy, potentially. Another benefit is the relatively low debt to GDP ratio of the Baltic states themselves relative to some other European economies. Ever since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, many countries have gone into significant debt to do bailouts and to put stimulus into their economies. That deteriorated even further during the pandemic, whereas relative to some of these other countries, government borrowing is still possible at very low interest rates because they have really good credit ratings. So the spending power of the government is still there, should that be necessary. And then I guess there's one other thing. Normally when inflation is at these levels, there can be significant political instability, mass protests, gridlock, strikes, civil unrest, crime, all these things running out of control that obviously significantly exacerbate the problem. That's not happening in the Baltic countries at the moment. Everybody has a shared understanding as to why the costs are increasing. They don't blame the government. They don't blame anyone else except Vladimir Putin and his war, and therefore things are continuing on as normal. They're trying to cope with the increasing costs rather than blaming the government for them, and that allows the government greater freedom of action to do long-term structural improvements without responding to immediate political crises. And that is just generally an unusual set of circumstances for a country or a region with this level of inflation. Also, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, they will be aware of the unique circumstances of the Baltic countries, and they're in a position to provide additional support. Okay, so what are the positive outcomes that could bring inflation under control? Well, the war could end. That would obviously have a significant impact. Vladimir Putin might be replaced. There might be a new government in Russia that was able to make an accord with the Ukrainians. They would then open their markets and kind of restore some level of commerce with the EU, and the Baltic countries would be foremost the beneficiaries of that reopening. Another thing that could happen is that Europe finds alternative energy sources. It's actively doing that at the moment. And therefore we can kind of presuppose that energy prices in the Baltic region have absolutely peaked, that they will come down over time, and this will reduce inflation both directly through the cost of energy, but also the flow-on effects through freight and other goods that I've described. So we have reached, I think, or are reaching the worst of the inflation rates in the Baltic region, with one giant asterisk, which is that the predictions so far among economists have been extremely poor. Previously, the OECD predicted that inflation in the Baltic would peak in the third quarter of this year. Things have in fact gotten worse and are accelerating. So who knows? Things could get worse before they get better. But definitely, I think the European Union needs to look at this, how the inflation is disproportionately affecting the Baltic countries, who in turn have assumed the greatest cost burden of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well in terms of supporting Ukraine. So what economically might be done to support the Baltic countries in reducing their inflation. We're seeing massive aid packages going into Ukraine, which is absolutely appropriate, but also it's having flow-on effects from the nearby countries that are contributing the most to resisting Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion. So that's just a really serious thing, because there are many people in the Baltic countries that are suffering as a consequence of this conflict, and they're too polite to talk about it because they go, well, you know, we might be suffering economically, but look at the Ukrainians and what they're going through, what they're losing. We have no real right to complain when they're the ones fighting for their very survival. And that's a very self-effacing and generous way to look at things, but it also gives everyone else an excuse not to actually deal with a very serious economic crisis, which is developing and worsening in that region. We are going to head into a recession in that region. That comes after a recession that occurred during the COVID period. So this region is really struggling. And there's also just one structural issue that I will talk about here is population. Yes, population has somewhat stabilized in the Baltic region, but it's not really increasing. And that's a severe limitation for the housing market because construction is outpacing demand. The thing that was going to make up demand was the increased amount of digital nomads, those people that during the pandemic were able to work remotely. That was potentially a permanent structural shift, that young people with a set of skills could live, for example, anywhere in Europe and be able to do their work from cheaper locations such as the Baltic countries. Well, that peaked, I think, already, and that now people are starting to return to work. The idea of completely working from home, even if a higher proportion of your total work week is from home, it's not total digital work remotely environment that we're now in. I think people have returned to the office environment in such way that even if they have greater work-life flexibility in terms of managing family and other obligations, they still have to reside in the same city as their employer to go into the office occasionally to attend in-person meetings. It's not like they can just go anywhere in Europe and work remotely, as was the case during the height of the pandemic where everything was locked down. And the Baltic countries, with their extremely advanced digital infrastructure, is an attractive location for these young people to go. That was going to increase housing demand in those areas. Well, I think that has also fallen off as well. So some of the long-term structural economic advantages that the Baltic countries were hitherto seeking to enjoy, I think, is more modest. It's still there, but more modest. And thus, we have to adjust our expectations accordingly. I'm really concerned about the economies of these Baltic countries because they could, if this war continues, if energy sources are not found that reduce the cost of imports, then these economies could become totally uncompetitive, and those people that are already underwater may not find a way out, given the fact that the emphasis is still rightly on Ukraine. A lot of these people are being forgotten. Anyway, that's my view. Please leave your comments down below. How has the increasing cost of goods and services impacted you if you live in the Baltic region? I really would like to hear about that. I would really like to see, everyday expenses, particularly those that perhaps live outside the main cities, but also if you do live in Tallinn or Vilnius, let me know. I would think everyone would like to hear your views on that. If you would like to support the channel, do so on Contribui, a Lithuanian startup. But again, cost of living, extremely expensive. Only if you can afford it, only if you're in that band with a high deposit would we want you to do that. Otherwise, please stay safe, look after each other, and ciao for now.